So, welcome to tonight's presentation, everyone. Of course, my name is Amanda. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Um, Oh, beautiful. Thank you, guys. Much appreciated. All right, I'm going to go back to full screen mode. I'm going to check back in on the chat at the end of the presentation, but please, if you want to unmute and ask a question in the middle, that is not a problem. So my name is Amanda. I'm the lead dietitian here at Functional Nutrition RX. This is one of our monthly seminars. So with the new dietary guidelines coming out, I've started to notice I got a lot of questions in practice and counseling sessions about them and the history of the guidelines. How are they made? How do you implement them into the day-to-day? So I figured let's put this into a digestible form for us to refer to. So, what are the dietary guidelines? They're meant to be an evidence based recommendation set to provide advice to the public, but also to advise to institutions like schools and military bases on what to eat and overall how to promote overall well being and reduce risk of chronic disease through food and nutrition. And of course, exercise has been added on too in previous years. So, of course, it's to make its main purpose is to help individuals to make informed choices, advise the public health, promote balanced nutrition across the entire lifespan. So today's presentation is really meant for the adult population, but dietary guidelines even go into infants and toddlers, for an example, and formula feeding as well. And of course, like I said, to reduce risk of chronic health conditions, especially heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and cancer as well. Those are all chronic metabolic health conditions. Key principles is to focus on nutrient dense foods since the inception of the dietary guidelines, which we'll go through the history of the guidelines. Just find it fascinating, and it's a cool basis to learn about. Of course, it's not just what to add, but what to limit. I like to focus a lot on what to add because inherently, when we're focusing on addition, it's easier to omit the not so great things like added sugars, sodium, and certain saturated fats. That's where the new guidance has a little fuzziness, but I want to provide clarification today. Most importantly, it's about maintaining a balanced and varied diet. But like I was saying, who is it designed for? This particular presentation is designed for ages, well, technically two and older. You can find, and I'll provide links for younger age groups like infants and toddlers as well. And like I said, it's meant to influence public policy, healthcare providers, schools, and military bases. So, the history of the guidelines. The early focus came about in the early 1900s to provide nutritional guidance to prevent chronic nutrient deficiencies that we were, not we meaning me, but like that our institutions had been noticing, like pellagra, which is from a B vitamin deficiency, scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, as well as vitamin D, severe vitamin D deficiency known as rickets. So that was from the early focus in the 1900s to then onward to the 1950s. It became a lot more on readiness of the population, given World War I, World War II, having a more military ready population, right? So a part of that was brought about in the 1900s, and you'll even see with the School Lunch Act that happened, I believe, right after World War I. But by the 1950s, the government instituted the basic four food groups, which started to promote more milk, meat, fruits and vegetables, as well as breads and cereals as our basic four food groups. This was to promote lack of deficiency from anemia, which is still one of the most common nutrient deficiencies that we see in modern day, and calcium deficiency, which as we get older can contribute to osteopenia, osteoporosis. Of course, it's important for nursing mothers and growing children, calcium. So that shift in focus changed from getting enough, right, and preventing nutritional inadequacies. And the focus started to shift towards more disease prevention and chronic health conditions. So that was by about the 1970s. as there was a growing increase in heart disease in our country, and even diabetes, not to the rates that we see today with diabetes and prediabetes, but it became more of an emerging focus in the 70s. So 1977, the dietary goals came out and aimed to promote health and reduce risk of those chronic diseases, and marked the start of diet, or nutrition, I like to say, as a tool for disease prevention. We started seeing a shift in dialogue of the old school, from the Ansel Keys study, uh, on, low sugar, low sodium, low fat, right? Which we've learned now in later days, it's not low fat, it's promotion of healthier fats versus less healthier fats. And we'll get more into that. The first dietary guidelines came from the dietary goals in 1980. So these dietary guidelines were meant to give Americans practical recommendations for eating healthier and to boil down scientific literature into a more digestible format for consumption. Yes, pun intended. So ongoing updates have been occurring every 5 years based on the latest scientific research and nutritional insights. As we know, the field of nutrition is technically pretty young in the grand scheme when we look at the entire field of medicine. And of course, we know that new information is coming out every year on nutrition and what to eat. And our food system is constantly evolving as well. So information needs to keep up with the changing times. That's part why registered dietitians, in order to maintain our RD national credential and our state licensure, we have to earn 75 hours of continuing education about every 5 years because of this constant evolution of information. So, like I said, the first dietary guidelines came out in 1980. 1992, we saw the food guide pyramid was launched, giving a visual representation of food groups and serving sizes and balanced diets. 2005, my pyramid replaced the old pyramid design, so that just further grew and emphasized more personalized nutrition and now physical activity in 2005 to improve dietary choices and represent the balance between physical activity and nutrition. 2011 noted the emergence of MyPlate, which we'll show images of in subsequent slides, which was a more simplified version of the food pyramid, giving a practical representation of the plate and demonstrating more percentages. So 1/4 of your plate protein, 1/4 being the starch, which everyone gets a little confused on. Starches like our whole grains, our potatoes, our peas, our corn, and most squash. And then, of course, 50% of the plate being fruits and or vegetables, right? And then, of course, those dietary guidelines were updated and MyPlate was maintained in 2020 to now 2025. We saw a emergence of the food pyramid again. So we're going to go into this and how we can apply past knowledge and current knowledge to make informed decisions for our health and our best well-being. Because I always think it's about first looking at the information, understanding and digesting the information, and then thinking about how that information, especially when it comes to nutrition, applies to the individual. Because every individual is different, not just how our bodies operate, but from our culture, our socioeconomic status, where we live, our roles in the community, and what we like to do and what we like to eat, right? So every person is different. And so we have to take this information and put it into a digestible form to apply to us, the individual. And of course, we know that this is important. Nutrition plays a vital role in our overall well-being. The food that we take in quite literally becomes the cells that make up our body. It becomes our organs, our eyes, our fluids, etc. Right? So what we eat is our body's way of communicating, in part through many other ways, with our environment and what's around us. Of course, eating nutritionally dense foods help our body to grow, repair, make energy, and of course, those essential nutrients allow us to do all these functions and essentially to live. it's part of our oxygen, right? If it wasn't for our food and our nutrient status, we wouldn't be here today. Following the dietary guidelines can serve as a path towards preventing chronic disease, like I mentioned, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, cancer. However, it does play a role in preventing or in part treating certain other health conditions, like I mentioned, osteoporosis, osteopenia, cancer, etc. And following a balanced diet can help with managing other health issues as well. Balanced diets support, of course, physical activity to keep us moving and to have that teeter totter between nutrition and physical activity. It can support the mental development of children and the physical development, right? So if we don't have enough vitamin D, for example, and we had an extreme vitamin D deficiency, we would develop rickets, which is that bowing of the legs, if we haven't seen images in the past of that. Making it very difficult to run and play sports, for example, things that children like to do typically. Making informed food choices improves long-term health outcomes, right? So our early development helps to develop our palate and our habits that can build us to our long-term habits when we're in our senior years. Dietary guidelines are scientifically based recommendations for healthy eating patterns, and they must go through a process to be approved. So there is a process in place for the creation of the dietary guidelines, which I just wanted to look into honestly when I was making this presentation. I find it interesting to see how things work and understanding the process and chain to which things are established. So first, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is formed with a panel of nutrition experts. I did make sure registered dietitians were on that panel because sometimes we are forgotten, which should not happen, but there are plenty of dietitians on the panel. So experts review thousands of studies, typically meta-analyses, or systematic meta-analyses, which are large studies that group together lots of randomized control trials into summarizable peer-reviewed pieces of literature to find commonality in what one randomized control trial found versus another randomized control trial, analyzing the methods, the populations used to come to those conclusions. Of course, there is another group, the Nutrition Evidence Systematic Review, that also follows a similar path to review the evidence that is submitted. A lot of this evidence is also based off of the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, NHANES, which is really quite interesting. It's a survey done of Americans on what's the common foods Americans are eating, typically using food frequency questionnaires. There's quite literally vans. We watched videos of this in undergraduate that travel around the country, especially in rural areas, and they provide various medical testing and looking for various nutritional deficiencies as well to get a better understanding of the needs of the populations around the United States, but also what is everyone eating? What's everyone doing? It's meant to kind of get a pulse. Of course, there's trying to establish and identify links between diet and health outcomes in this step. Next, it goes to an advisory report. So the DGAC, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, publishes a scientific report with recommendations of their findings. It's meant to be focused completely on evidence versus policy, and it is sent to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services as well. Public and agencies have input. The agencies that have input on this from the USDA and Health and Human Services include NIH, CDC, and FDA. So it goes through essentially three different agencies. It's open to public feedback, which is very cool, making it meant to be a diplomatic process of scientists, industry leading specialists, and the general public to comment on this draft of guidance that is put out. After that information is agreed upon, it goes towards modeling, right? So modeling meaning looking at how it would be, the information would be presented, right? Modeling my plate, for example, versus pyramid format, right? What can be an easy to identify graphic for someone to be able to absorb and then implement the information in the day to day. And also, there are different reports, which I'll share, which is just, I find it fascinating what gets put out. Different reports based on if you need 1,200 calories a day, how do these food groups and the portions recommended fit into this guidance, and can help to go a little deeper. So it's more than just the image and the model. There's actually many PDF documents essentially put out for you to even go deeper and deeper for your individual needs. So it's cool to look at. Dietitians utilize these a lot to make the information digestible and put into counseling and easy to implement goals. It ensures that it meets nutrient needs, right? Are we getting enough calcium, B vitamins, iron, magnesium is another one that should be focused on, for example, that they fit calorie limits, right? Are we saying, okay, have 10 servings of dietary fat? Well, if you want me to have, you know, 5 servings of fruits and vegetables and have 100 grams of protein per day, can this meet a 1,400 calorie diet, right? So it's meant to ensure that it can meet not just nutrient needs, but fit calorie limits as well, as everything is in balance, and are practical for Americans, right? Is this financially sustainable? Is this accessible for most people across all different areas, right? Rural, urban, suburban, etc. Different areas across the country, east, west, north, south. And then after that, after the modeling phase, the final guidelines are published by the USDA and Health and Human Services. And they're to be updated every 5 years as nutrition and the food system is ever evolving. And it's meant to be used for federal nutrition program guidance, public health policy, and nutrition education. So, some simple takeaways: it's meant to go from evidence based review of literature to a review by the USDA, Health and Human Services, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and the Nutrition Evidence System review. Then it goes for public input, then into modeling, and then into guidelines. So I just found that to be interesting. Um, but of course, I just want to check in real quick before I go into this. If everybody's been admitted that needs to be admitted, and I'm going to admit Jacqueline real quick. Admit, beautiful. Going back to full share. So it got me curious before we go into our new current guidelines what goes on in other parts of the world, right? I always like to refer to Canada as my plate sometimes because there's just a good visual representation of actual food. You don't see that in many other countries, including the US. So Canada utilizes like a my plate diagram still, where you see half the plate fruits and vegetables, 1/4 being protein, and it does include some plant proteins too. As for our vegans or vegetarians or those on kidney specific diets that are trying to reduce burden on the kidneys, and as well as, of course, our starches. One thing, even though I love Canada's visual representation, they did put peas and potatoes, although they are a vegetable, they are a starchy vegetable, and they should really go into this category. If you are more carnivorous, beans can also go into the starchy category. So that's what makes the modeling a little challenging, is that, it's like, okay, this two things can be true, but what is true for the individual? So that's where it comes to working with a nutrition professional to really help boil it down to what works for you. The UK utilizes a my plate similar diagram here, where we could see grains taking up a large chunk, fruits and vegetables taking up a large chunk, and then, of course, meats being about 30% of the plate, and seafood, and then dairy has a place on the plate to make room for, of course, water here on the top right corner. That's where it varies from our old My Plate guideline. You do see a little bit of an emphasis on dietary fats here, and they even say, okay, sweets can be a part of a diet, healthier diet, but to be eaten less often and in small amounts. So they have to pack a lot of information into one diagram, which is it's always interesting to see how it gets presented. Ireland uses the pyramid, as you could see, and so does Switzerland. Of course, France has a very different one than the others. They use a steps model. where you could see they're talking about meats and seafood as the first step. And then the more dairy section, emphasizing cheeses and yogurts, glass of milk, physical activity in the middle of that step representation, grains and starches next, and then fruits and vegetables at the top. So I would surmise that they're emphasizing, the higher the step level of importance, but these steps everyone needs to take to get to the top. Of course, you do see dietary fat here as well, and they're using a eyeglass to represent smaller quantities. And of course, they still have water. Mexico, of course, it was very hard to get a good image, so I'm sorry it's a little cloudy. They also emphasize a plate diagram. But you guys can look into this in more depth. I just wanted to share, just it's different, but yet food is something that unites everybody. Everybody eats, and sitting down to enjoy a meal with somebody can, of course, bring everyone together. So, our overview of our food groups, everyone gets a little confused on the food groups. We have fruits, right? Fruits are carbohydrates. Of course, they are vitamin and mineral powerhouses, and they provide us with a little bit of sweetness to help satisfy cravings and provide us with fiber. Grains, grains are also a vital source of energy. They provide us with complex carbohydrates that help to feed our gut microbiome due to its fiber contents. They also contain a lot of essential nutrients, including some of our B vitamins as well, especially when they're in the whole grain form versus the refined grain form. Refining the grain we'll get more into in subsequent slides. Of course, grains are also carbs. Vegetables are also carbs, right? So vegetables are also rich in nutrients. So they're what you call nutritionally dense in that they are high in nutrients but low in calories. They also contribute to our fiber. So if you notice, often carbs tend to be the major contributor to our dietary fiber, which helps to regulate digestion, reduce risk for heart disease, reduce risk for diabetes as well. Fiber is a powerhouse in the diet. Of course, protein. Protein is crucial for building and repairing tissues. If so, we can take carbs and convert them to fat, fat and convert them to protein. Sorry, we can take fat and convert that to carbs, carbs and convert it to fat, and we can even take protein and convert it to carbs or fat. But fats and carbs cannot be converted to protein in the body. So if you're not eating enough protein, your body needs to get it from other places. That could be our own musculature, like our skeletal muscle. So protein is absolutely essential for building and repairing tissues. Carbs are essential for making energy, right? And we'll get more into dietary fats, but protein includes our meats, our poultry, our fish. Beans have protein. They also have starchy and fibrous components as well. Beans are a little enigmatic to some because they are one of those mixed foods. So you'll sometimes see them labeled as a vegetable, or sometimes see them labeled as a starch, or sometimes see them labeled as a protein. Beans typically you count in the starchy section, but it does boost up your protein in your meal, similar to whole grains, right? Whole grains can have a small amount of protein in them, but they're predominantly a starchy carb, right? So nuts and seeds are predominantly a fat, but they do have some protein as well, right? So, like we know, nothing in this world is black and white, yin and yang. There's a little bit of a mixture of nutrients in some foods, like milk, right? Milk is predominantly a carbohydrate, but can have protein in it and can have fat in it too. So, protein can be in a variety of different foods and promotes muscular health and overall well being. Protein helps to keep us full, along with fiber and dietary fat. Dietary fats are also essential for providing energy, and they support overall body functions. They help to build the membrane, our cellular membranes, and with the absorption of fat soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. So those are fat soluble vitamins. Those you can take in excess actually, because they are stored in fat and need fat to be absorbed, where other vitamins are typically water soluble. Of course, fats play a role in brain health. Our brain is predominantly made up of omega 3s. but runs off glucose, aka carbs, if you're not in ketosis. And of course, help to play a role in hormone production. So, healthy fats are going to include our oils, our nuts, our seeds, our avocados. Fatty fish are one of those multifaceted foods in that they have protein, but also healthy omega 3 rich dietary fat. Of course, dietary fats can contribute to heart health, and then certain dietary fats can detract from heart health. We were talking about the USDA MyPlate design earlier. So on the top left is the MyPlate design that we saw introduced in 2011, which depicts that one-fourth of your plate grains, one-fourth of your plate protein, and half your plate fruits and vegetables. So you can see why I might have liked the Canadian version a lot, where it had actual pictures of food. So it's very easy for people to interpret. Harvard even went another step because, as you could see, the Dairy Council has the dairy circle placed in the USDA MyPlate diagram, where the Harvard Healthy Plate actually replaced that with water. We can get calcium from other places, but yes, dairy is one of our major contributors of dietary calcium. You can also get it from foods like sardines, almonds, your leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, chickpeas, just to name a few. Of course, it's very similar though in the percentage format. It's just a little bit more elaborated upon with the Harvard version of MyPlate so that individuals can best interpret the food groups and what foods fall in those food groups. And that brings us to today. Um, the new dietary guidelines, the 2025 dietary guidelines, emphasize the importance of nutrient dense foods and a healthy eating pattern to promote overall health throughout all life sizes, all life stages. So the new focus, so every time a new model comes out or new dietary guidelines come out, there's typically another way to like up the ante is how I like to describe it. So the new way that the dietary guidelines are evolving, it's actually pretty similar to what it's been in the past, except for the visual representation, but the language in the subtext below is pretty similar. The new addition is to really try to focus on minimally processed and and nutrient rich foods, taking us away from this ever evolving food system that is adding more and more ingredients into our food and other steps of processing, which we'll get more into those ingredients. The other new major addition was the increase in the daily allowance of protein, which we'll get to, and how to meet those guidelines. Um, I remember when I was in my supervised practice, it was such a big deal that they upped the RDA, the recommended daily allowance of protein, to zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram, from 0 0.8 grams per kilogram to 1 gram per kilogram, and now it's on the low end 1.2. So it's ever increasing. So we'll discuss how we can maintain an elevated protein intake without taking in, lots of saturated fats or processed ingredients in the process. Of course, it still recommends food choices that are, of course, incorporating of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, beans, lentils, nuts, seeds, and dairy, as well as fortified dairy alternatives, right? So we do have a large lactose intolerance population that is growing. Whole foods, of course, are going to improve diet quality, and of course, whole minimally processed foods will have more nutrients in it, not just vitamins and minerals, but phytonutrients. So the new pyramid on the right, it's different from MyPlate in that it's not as applicable, if that makes sense. MyPlate's very situational. Okay, when I'm making my plate, how much am I going to put in one quadrant versus another quadrant? What falls in that quadrant? Of course, the new food pyramid does emphasize, you see lettuce, you see carrots, you see chicken, but what's this hierarchy, right? Grains are at the very bottom. Um, you see fats middle towards the top, but how much am I supposed to have? So I do want to provide clarity there. I have a friend, he makes a joke. He's like, am I going to have my daily rotisserie chicken? So it's just, there's some confusion, but there is a good message with the elevation in protein intake, the minimally processed foods. So we have to take that information as every model that comes out, or guidelines that come out, they don't tend to be perfect, right? It's really hard sometimes to summarize everything. So we place understanding, but then we also want to emphasize understanding, right? So fruits and vegetables, right? Why are they recommended in such high quantities, 5 servings a day? Many Americans are lucky to get maybe one serving of fruit or one serving of vegetables a day. So, like we were saying, fruits and vegetables contain phytonutrients. Phytonutrients, we did a whole presentation that's on our Functional Nutrition RX YouTube, where you can find our other presentations that we've given in the past, those virtual wellness seminars. But phytonutrients, they give our plants color or pigment, right? So you'll find, for example, tomatoes. Tomatoes give tomatoes have lycopene in them, and lycopene, when we ingest it, is beneficial for our heart, right? These plants produce these pigments often as ways for them to protect themselves. So, something I found really interesting is that organic produce tend to have a lot more phytonutrients in it because they've had to mount up more resilience against bugs and other things that would weeds, whatnot, etc., versus having them sprayed with different pesticides or weed killers, which are kind of doing that work for them. So phytonutrients are kind of like the plant's security system, but in turn, when we take that in, there's benefits for our body. Of course, this is where that concept of eat the rainbow comes from, right? So if I'm just eating green, all right, green's great. It's good for my vasculature, my brain, can be having anti-tumorigenic, anti-cancer properties to it. But then I'm just only getting those benefits of green. What about purple, which is good for my immune system, those polyphenols, great for my enteric lining of my intestines, right? Of course, white. Everyone's told don't eat white foods. Well, garlic's white, cauliflower's white. Well, there is a benefit there, especially for our liver, right? They tend to be more sulfur producing foods, which helps our liver to detoxify, for example, especially our allium plants, like our shallots, our onions, for example. So, this is where Eat the Rainbow comes from. So if you're taking in the recommended intake of 2 fruits per day, maybe a fruit at breakfast and a fruit at snack, right? Um, or heck, you can get 2 fruits in at breakfast, a smoothie, right? You could do 2 fruits in a smoothie, a half a banana and about 3/4 cup of berries, some protein powder. Maybe if you want to go for gold, put some veggies in there, like some microgreens or spinach, put some chia seeds in there. Now we got healthy fat, and then some almond milk. Great. Now I'm already getting 3 servings of between fruits and vegetables just in my breakfast alone, right? So see this as a minimum target, but it depends on what your average intake of that produce is to begin with, and try to up the ante by maybe 1 to 2 extra servings a day or in your week, depending on your palatability, and really trying to experiment with other ways to enjoy those foods if you struggle to enjoy them. Like, for example, I really do not like raw broccoli. There's nothing that will really make me want to have it, even if it's smothered in ranch. I can't do it. No, thank you. But I love raw broccoli. I mean, love cooked broccoli, for example, maybe with a little Parmesan cheese, rich in magnesium, low in saturated fat, has a little protein with it. Awesome. Some garlic. So we don't want to ever say, I don't like that one vegetable, or maybe look at it as, okay, maybe I don't like it prepared in that particular way, but I might like it prepared in a different way. And keeping open minded, of course, is always key throughout life. Of course, with the vegetable aspect, right? We mentioned 2 fruits a day, maybe one at breakfast, one at snack. But with the servings of vegetables, note a serving of vegetables is typically about a third to a half of a cup. So it's easy when you see it that way, or another, that depends on the vegetable. It's typically about, I should say, 1 cup cooked, a half a cup, I mean, half a cup cooked, 1 cup raw. Sorry, my brain's getting ahead of my mouth. But say you have a half a cup of broccoli or a half a cup of spinach cooked, that's relatively a small portion. If you wanted to have 2 or 3 portions, a cup and a half of cooked spinach at a meal, that's wonderful, especially if you're balancing it with some chicken, a little olive oil, maybe some rice, for example. Okay, now you're incorporating all the food groups and it's still not a overtly calorically dense meal, and it's still pretty voluminous to keep us full. So vegetables are really great at lunch and dinner. On the side, you could do salad or roasted, grilled, etc. But you want to try to eat a variety of colors. This can happen when you're trying to eat with the seasons. Of course, there is the Eat the Rainbow Challenge tracker below, which is kind of fun to, put on your fridge and try to see at first just how many colors you get in your week. We made this a long time ago. I would put blue and purple in the same category though, just to keep it simple. But doing this can reduce risk for cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and obesity, which is great, and also can help your digestion. The protein intake recommendations, this is where we saw a big change, right? So the protein recommended intake jumped from 1 gram per kilogram body weight to 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight. Everyone's needs are a little different, especially if you're strength training, you're going to be on that upper end. If you have more muscle mass to sustain, you're going to be on that upper end. And depending on certain conditions you might have, health conditions. But many people don't, in the United States, don't think in kilograms, right? We have a different standard of measure. So, for example, if a person weighs about 154 pounds, you typically, what you do is you divide pounds by 2.2 to get kilograms, and then you multiply that by based on where that person can fall in that range, 1.2 to 1.6. Of course, working with a registered dietitian is really important for factoring your needs, but that 70-kilogram individual that weighs about 154 pounds, if you're looking at that 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight, their recommended protein intake is between about 84 to 112 grams of protein per day. So that looks like about 30 grams of protein per meal if someone's having 3 meals, and then about two snacks with about 10 grams of protein to reach that upper end of the range. Some days you might take in a little bit more protein, some days a little less. Of course, you want to try to be systematic, but that's, just I'd like to break that down that way. Some of you might be thinking, what is 30 grams of protein? So you want to think in ounces. 1 ounce of protein is about seven grams of just pure protein to ingest. So if you're taking in about 4 ounces of most meats, that's going to be about 28 grams of protein. And then you might get a couple grams here from the beans or a couple grams here from the whole grains, for example, or the nuts or seeds. So that's how we kind of break that down, if that makes any sense. Protein is best to be distributed throughout meals to support muscle synthesis, right? We don't want to try to eat 112 grams in one sitting. It is a myth that you can't absorb more than 40 grams per sitting, but it's going to be best absorbed when you spread it out throughout the day as you're keeping a consistent supply of amino acids, which are the smallest breakdown form of protein, as sugar is the smallest breakdown form of carbs in your bloodstream. So your body is constantly building and breaking down proteins, for example, building up enzyme proteins in your digestive tract and maybe breaking down musculature to do so, for example. So building and breaking down at the same time. Of course, your main protein sources are typically fish and seafood, lean meat and poultry, right? Uh, Eggs, beans and lentils, and nuts and seeds. The most bioavailable form of protein, meaning what you eat is what you're going to absorb, are egg whites, actually. Egg whites are there's typically about 5 grams of protein in one egg white and about 7 grams of protein total in an egg. But the egg whites are pretty much pure protein, where the yolk does contain some dietary fat. Whole grains are next. So you saw a bit of a whole grain reduction on the new dietary guidelines, reducing the amount of servings of grains per day. I wish it was clarified a little bit more in terms of, yes, like still have your starches, make 1/4 of your plate starches, but they could be grains, they could be foods like potatoes, which are really great natural producers, will help your body to naturally produce butyrate, which helps to maintain this healthy mucus lining. I know it sounds kind of funny, on the lining of your intestines, which can actually protect your body from absorbing harmful pathogens or the creation of what's called leaky gut, or the proper term is increased gut permeability, right? Beans can also fall in that category too. About one serving of whole grains is considered about 1/4 of a cup. So some of you, depending on your cardiovascular output and your activity, your size and stature, how much, your net activity throughout the day, right? Everyone needs a different varying amount of carbs. So it still should be individualized. But one serving is typically about 1/3 to 1/2 of a cup, but you can have multiple servings in that portion size per se. So maybe making 1 to 2 meals containing your grains, and then another meal in your day, like that smoothie we're talking about, you're bumping up the fruit, or you're having a meal that has, some beans in it, for example, instead of the grains, or a potato, right? So that's part of your vegetables. Some examples of whole grains: brown rice, oats, quinoa, whole wheat bread, like our Dave's Killer Bread, for example. And whole grains provide fiber, B vitamins, and sustain energy. You could see here on the bottom right of the screen, there's an image of a whole grain versus a refined grain. The difference between the two is that a whole grain, you could see that outer perimeter is the bran, right? So that's going to contain fiber and some vitamins as well as phytonutrients. Inside of that, you have the endosperm, which is still a part of the refined grain. And inside of that, you're going to see the germ, which that can also contain some vitamin E, for example. So in that refining process, the germ and the bran, which have a lot of health promoting properties, gets removed, and that endosperm is what remains. You will see with refined grains that they can be enriched or fortified with other vitamins and minerals, but those are not naturally containing vitamins and minerals of that food. Not necessarily good nor bad, it just depends on the person, right? Some people have difficulty absorbing those fortified and enriched B vitamins, for example, depending on certain genetic traits. Uh, Healthy fats and dairy, we want to consider. We're going to do a slide on just healthy fats alone, but healthy fats support brain function, like I was saying, the basis of hormone production and heart health. Some of those healthy fats include olive oil, avocados, nuts, seeds, fatty fish, and salmon, which are to be included based on our dietary guidelines. We'll go a little bit more into the other foods that were recommended as well in the dietary fat category. Dairy and other fortified alternatives, right? It's important to note the alternatives, as some can't consume dairy, um, that are needed to provide calcium as well as vitamin D and protein. So if you cannot consume calcium, like dairy, calcium from dairy, of course, looking at your beans, your nuts, your seeds, and fortified alternatives like certain brands of almond milk. And you can see the calcium addition in the ingredient section. Sometimes they promote it on the front too, which makes it nice. They did recommend in the new dietary guidelines to consume whole fat dairy. I'm going to sound a little old school. It really can depend on the person, and it also depends on where that dairy is coming from, right? Similar to our red meat. We don't want to have it all the time, but say we're having red meat, or say we're having whole fat dairy, or even our eggs. The nutrition of the animal is going to impact our nutrition, right? So if that animal is more pasture raised or free range, the type of fat that that animal produces is going to be more omega-3 rich, and less of the inflammatory types of saturated fat will be in that food product, right? However, if you're like me and I love to have, Greek yogurt with lots of nuts and seeds, and I'm trying to get that in within my calorie budget for the day, and especially that fiber from those nuts and seeds and other vitamins and minerals from that, I might choose a lower fat or non-fat dairy, especially if I see that they're not adding sugar in or any other processed ingredients to do so. They're just extracting the fat. So it can depend on the person. Maybe they don't like nuts or seeds, or maybe they can't have them for certain allergy or intolerance reasons. Okay. Um, but it's thinking about the balance of the meal and the synergistic effect of the diet. So of course, like if that is like a Nancy's brand, for example, or Stonyfield grass-fed Greek yogurt, right? That getting the whole fat version of that is not so detrimental. It's just a matter of, okay, what's my calorie budget, and do I want to have nuts or seeds on my yogurt? So it kind of depends. Like things depend a little bit. So recommended intake is typically about 2 to 3 servings of dairy or fortified alternatives per day. So, like we were saying, healthy fats. Healthy fats are also going to include our tuna, our salmon, our fatty fish as well, and then our avocados. The newer addition that you're seeing now with the updated dietary guidelines is beef tallow and butter. Butter actually is the food that has the highest natural amount of butyrate in it. So there is that positive. Butter, especially the certain brands like Vital Farms or Kerrygold, are grass fed. And there is sometimes just not a place for olive oil, even though I love olive oil and I come from an Italian family that puts olive oil on everything. But sometimes you just want a little bread and butter, right? You're pairing a fat with a carb. Um, so with that being said, if you're getting the grass-fed butter, if you notice that like the Kerrygold, when you open up the wrapper, it's a little bit more of that golden color. Same when you look at pasture, I'm trying to enunciate well, pasture raised versus pasteurized, two different things. Pasture raised eggs, for example, has more of that deep orange horizony color to them. Or how grass-fed beef sometimes has a little bit of a different taste when you first start adjusting to grass-fed beef. Not good nor bad, just different. That's the nutrients in it, right? Those colors are the vitamin A and the vitamin E that are more pronounced in those grass-fed foods. So I see it as, all right, if you're within your dietary allowance of your fats in your meal and your portions, and it's not your go-to fat for like the pan, for example, right? Olive oil or avocado oil is typically best, but you want to use it. There's some occasions where other oils and other foods just don't fit for your palate or your cultural needs when cooking. Then okay, go for the butter, but then go for grass fed. Um, it's where the beef tallow comes in as well. If you're gonna have it, do grass fed. Personally, I love tallow for my skin. When I'm actually using it, my skin is super hydrated, and I use an olive oil based grass fed tallow. And it's not as thick as people really think it is. Saturated fat is the big question, right? So that's why I say olive oil is king. Olive oil is rich in antioxidants like oleocanthal. It's the cornerstone fat of the Mediterranean diet. It's liquid at room temperature, right? It's a monounsaturated fat. And when one replaces regular butter or margarine in their diet with olive oil, they dramatically reduce their risk for stroke, for example. So we still want to try to consume less than 10% of our total calories from saturated fats. So that could range typically from 7 to 15 grams in a day of saturated fat. So to do so, you still want to balance, right, with avocados, olives, nuts, seeds, omega 3s from fatty fish. And maybe if you're going to have a butter, go for that grass fed butter, but it's not an all the time, this is my predominant fat that I use to lubricate the pan with and cook everything in. We've learned from that, right? So through past dietary guidelines. So, of course, limiting highly processed foods like the margarines with those processed saturated fats, that's really a key takeaway. Um, and to have more of these whole food fats, right? And gone is the day of the I can't believe it's not butter. Oh, my lamp. Okay. Foods to limit based on the dietary guidelines is to reduce intake of foods that contribute to chronic disease, right? We're approaching, what is it, about 50% of the population is either overweight or obese. So, of course, highly processed foods are getting the finger pointed at them because they can be highly palatative, affordable, they're very readily available. Think about vending machines when we were growing up in schools and businesses. They were everywhere. I don't see them as much, but it could just be the locations that I tend to live around and be. But of course, they're easy to consume in large quantities, right? Um, they have a lot of preservatives, added sugars, refined grains. Think about our cereals like our Fruit Loops, right? Unhealthy fats, artificial colors. You want to look for terms that can connote that something is a refined grain, like a white bread or a pastry, like enriched flour, bleached flour. Wheat flour is not necessarily whole wheat. One of the fun little tricks, it's not perfect, but an easy fun little trick is to identify if something's a whole grain, look at the ingredients, and before the first comma, so the first ingredient, you should see the word whole, right? Like wheat flour, no, but whole wheat flour, yes. Um, Whole enriched brown rice. So white flour, degerminated cornmeal, malted barley flour, etc. Of course, these foods tend to also exceed the recommended guidance for sodium. So you can use I love the 5 is fine, 20 is plenty. When we go over the label, I'll get a little more into that. But if you see with the percent daily values, something that you don't want to have a lot of, like saturated fat or salt, depending on your needs and your level of perspiration and activity, uh, closer to fine, closer to 5 is fine, closer to 20 is plenty, right? So if you're starting to tip over that 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15% on the daily values percentages, okay, this is going to be higher in something that I really don't want to be having too much in excess. Added sugar. We still don't have an RDA in this country, a recommended daily allowance for sugar, but you want sugar to remain below 10% of total calories. Typically, when you look at the label, if the sugar is less than 10 to 12, I like to say single digits, easy to remember, that is going to be better. And you want to limit added sugars in general as much as possible. So total sugars, aim for single digits, added sugars as low as possible. But just remember, like honey can be added sugar. So honey is of course still going to contribute to glycemic load and how much your blood sugar spikes, but sometimes there's pros and cons of different foods, as honey is very good for our digestive lining. And if that is the added sugar that you tend to take in, and it's in a quantity that is less than 10% of your daily calories, or for females under about 26 grams per day, or males under about 25 grams per day, of course less is best. But if it's the honey, that's not as big of a deal versus like the white table sugar, for example, or those sugar alcohols are something that we want to go into as well. And of course, we're still talking about omitting fried foods from the diet. I think a lot of people have moved away from frying in the home. I hear a lot of individuals that come in for counseling talking about utilizing their air fryers. So that's wonderful. Of course, in nutrition counseling, I'm seeing the people that are ready, willing, and able to come through the office door for nutrition, right? So that's not the entire population. But from firsthand experience, I'm not hearing a lot of home frying as much anymore in my local area. But of course, restaurants, that seems to be the main culprit of what I tend to see as a contributing factor with regard to fried foods in our day to day eating. Limiting these foods, of course, is going to support our metabolic health as well as our cardiovascular health, which many of us do know and are aware of. So we're talking about all these different food groups, but how do we implement them in our day, right? I still think the healthy plate method is a really great visual representation that just because it's not our current dietary guideline model doesn't mean that we can't take, the information, the applicability of that modeling tool and apply it to some of the new updates like the limiting processed foods, of course, the elevation in protein, right? So it's about taking bits and pieces of correct information and apply it to the day to day. So with breakfast, right, an example meal balanced day to incorporate the dietary guidelines would include, having whole grains like an oatmeal with breakfast with some fruit, maybe some low fat milk, or maybe 1 ounce of cheese with some eggs, or protein powder in that oatmeal. You could do, for example, even at breakfast, you could do one whole egg with about a half a cup of egg whites, right? You're helping to reach your protein intake there, with 1 to 2 slices of whole grain bread, a piece of fruit, and maybe some avocado, right? That would be a very balanced breakfast. Lunch, of course, think of it as, do I have a protein like chicken, chicken salad with some mixed vegetables and some whole grain bread, right? A lean protein plus vegetables and a whole grain. That chicken salad has some dietary fat with it. So we could utilize avocado as the binder or like an olive oil based mayo. So you're incorporating each of those major food groups. Snack, having some Greek yogurt, getting some calcium in with some nuts and a piece of fruit maybe. And then at dinner, having some salmon that has some healthy fat, brown rice, some steamed vegetables or a side salad or roasted vegetables on a sheet pan in the oven, and maybe a little sprinkle of Parmesan cheese in case, you didn't get a little bit of that calcium earlier in the day. Personally, I like to utilize fortified almond milk. It just helps to keep me within my caloric budget, but everyone's different. Maybe I'll take the almond milk, but I'll still have dairy from the yogurt or the cottage cheese, right? It's doing what works for us. Key daily habits, though, is to really try to make sure you have a fruit and or vegetable with every meal. I feel like that's something that I see that makes such a big impact and gets overlooked so much, just because it might be outside of habits for some. But we can always make that habit, right? Choose whole grains over refined grains, or even beans and legumes and starchy vegetables in that starch section. Again, starchy vegetables are peas, corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and most squash. I say most squash because zucchini, summer squash, some people call that yellow zucchini, and spaghetti squash are non starchy vegetables. So eat as much of those as you like. But those other starches, like our other starchy squashes, SS got me, uh, the delicata squash, for example, the acorn squash. They're not, they're not bad. They're just different. We just want to try to keep them in a portion for our needs. Proteins. When we say lean proteins, try to aim for proteins that swim, fly, or grow from the ground. Of course, if we're having red meat, typically about 2 times a week or less, depending on our iron needs. Aiming for, if it's a chopped meat, 90% or more lean, or aiming for leaner cuts of that meat, like especially if it ends in loin, right? Like a pork tenderloin or sirloin, for example. Limit added sugars, read the labels, check out that new added sugar section that's been added, I want to say, in the last 10 years to the food label. Check out saturated fats. How much am I getting? In a serving, you could do that 5 is fine, 20 is plenty concept that I was talking about, or trying to keep it in a serving under about 3 grams. Stay hydrated with water, right? The new dietary guidelines do emphasize water. There isn't a, half your body weight in fluid ounces kind of a guideline. So this is where dietitians help to apply information to a more to the public in a more applicable format to their own unique individual needs, but typically about half your body weight in fluid ounces of water. And of course, building balanced meals, right? We're not going to have a meal of just protein and then a meal of just vegetables and then a meal of just carbs, but to build balanced meals throughout the day. So with the nutrition facts label, of course, we want to avoid relying on overly packaged food. So typically, if it doesn't have a label, right, like a produce item, that's a good sign, right? Just of course, time and place and environment of where we're getting that food from. But yeah, so that's something to think about. Follow serving sizes as a guide to start, right? So that's at the very top of the label if you're uncertain how much your particular unique needs are. When in doubt, try to stick to the serving size at the top. Aim to consume lower saturated fat. So this product only has about 1 gram of saturated fat. We see that the total fat is 8 grams in that section labeled 8. Well, sorry, 8 total grams of fat in that section labeled 3. So I know if I subtract 1 from 8, that there's about 7 grams of healthy fat typically in that food item. So the food label isn't required to mention monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, or different subsidies like omega 3s, but you can construe okay, if there's 0 grams of trans fats and there's only 1 gram of saturated fat, but there's a total fat of 8, then I know there's probably about 7 grams or so of typically heart healthy fat coming from that food item. If if you do prefer looking at grams, like I was saying, less than 3 grams of saturated fat is a good guideline when you're looking at the label. Or if there is no label for a food, like some like meats, for example, pop it into a local, like into one of your calorie trackers, like a Chronometer or a MyFitnessPal, for example, and look up, okay, what is 3 ounces of sirloin, right? We live in the information age. So if we want to know the information, it's quite literally at our fingertips. Um, or ask a registered dietitian. We're here to support that. Percent daily values. So, like we were saying, the 5 is fine, 20 is plenty. So, we could see for the saturated fat line item, it's closer to 5%. So, 5% is fine, 20 is plenty. Of course, if it's over 10%, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's over 10% of your unique daily needs. So, that's something that you want to factor one-on-one with a dietitian. Sodium, if you're a average healthy adult, your goal of sodium is less than 2,300 milligrams per day, depending on your level of perspiration and physical activity. So that 5 is fine, 20 is plenty applies to sodium as well. Typically, if it's under about 160 milligrams of sodium, it's going to be considered a low sodium food. So, of course, if you have a food that's about 800 milligrams of sodium, then that should be a red flag, for example. But again, we can use those percent daily values as a guideline or a backboard. Fiber, it's kind of the inverse, right? So I skipped over cholesterol. Dietary cholesterol, there's talks to even take it off the food label. Dietary cholesterol has been shown to not really contribute to serum cholesterol, what's in your blood. Inflammatory saturated fats, sugar, increased gut permeability. There's a whole genetics. There's a whole slew of potential contributors that can relate to heart disease or cholesterol buildup. And total carbs are really based on your own individual needs. Typically, for a healthy adult, you're going to see somewhere between 30 on the very low end to about 65 grams of carbs in a total meal. A snack, about 15 to 30 grams of total carbs. Dietary fiber is really important. So dietary fiber is indigestible by us, but feeds the microbiome, right? That whole, I call it almost like another organ of bacteria in our intestines. So dietary fiber, it's the inverse, right? So you know how I was saying 5 is fine, 20 is plenty when it comes to saturated fat and sodium? Well, we want to have a lot of fiber for what we can tolerate. So we can see that this item is 4 grams of fiber. So that we see that it's 14% of our daily value. Remember, 5 is fine, 20 is plenty, but it's the inverse when it's something that you want a lot of, right? So fiber, please, close to the 20%, the better, as long as your digestive tract is adjusted to it. You're drinking water, you're moving your body to help move that fiber through your intestines. Higher the better. So for an item to say a good source of dietary fiber on the food packaging, you want it to be over 10%. It cannot say that on the package label unless it's over 10% of that daily value. Total sugars, we were saying, try to keep it single digits. That's going to be best. Added sugars per day, we want to keep less than 25 grams for women, less than 36 grams for men of those added sugars. Total sugars, like we said, single digits. Protein is very unique for the individual, but on the low end, and that's me being very liberalized, is 20 grams of protein, right? Depends on our size and stature, our activity. If I'm being very cautious in what I'm recommending to make sure I'm hitting that high amount, so maybe someone doesn't snack, whatnot, upwards to like 35, 40 for females, for example, males even higher. So that is very, very unique. So it's not as easy to say like the guidelines, like I was saying, like carbohydrates. Um, but with protein, typically in a snack, 7 grams is considered, minimum serving. If, when you're having a snack, you want to have a protein and or healthy fat with a carb. So to see that something is a good moderate source, look for 7 grams for a snack with regard to your protein. 5 grams for a fat. Ingredients to avoid or limit on food labels. So actually, when I was looking up information for the presentation today, I'm sharing my screen. I'm going to go into these labels, but I was looking at, the scientific foundation behind the dietary guidelines, which I could share. It's just interesting to see, where they pulled certain ingredients from and the citations behind them, which is cool, the references. So you'll see like the Lancet, for example, it's a great journal. You'll also see the British Medical Journal. You'll also see the International Journal of Epidemiology. So you'll see the citations behind it, which is cool if you want to read the studies. Hope everyone can see my screen. I'm going to enlarge it. But these were in particular a lot of the ingredients that are being, gone after and taken off the GRAS list, which is a list of ingredients that's generally recognizable as safe and having their privileges revoked. So partially hydrogenated vegetable oils that you'll see contributes to like trans fats, and on the label it'll say 0 grams of trans fat, but like there is some manipulation going on there, because if it's like 0.3 grams of trans fats, or 0.2, zero point 0.3, and I know I sound super myopic about it, but they don't have to put it as like a gram on the food label. But if you're having multiple servings of that food, you're having multiple grams of trans fats, which are really not great not great for our bodies. So much so that Congress even declared war on trans fats in the early 2000s. So if you see ingredients saying partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, right? That's something to think about. Like think about, like, oh my gosh, my mom used to, not to throw her under the bus, I used to be a partaker in this as well. Like Crisco, right? Vegetable oils, for example, margarines, processed baked goods, fried foods will contain this, right? Brominated vegetable oil, you don't really see that so often in the everyday food supply, maybe more commercial food supply, and more for restaurants, things like that, institutionalized cooking. Sodium benzoate, and they go on to describe common and acidic foods and drinks, sodas, jams to inhibit microbes. So they give the actual ingredient, like MSG, monosodium glutamate, used in part for umami flavor in soup, snacks, seasonings, frozen dinners, and restaurant foods. So I thought that this was a great list, right? Like sucralose, aka Splenda, which has been linked to cancer actually. Sugar alcohols, which I wanted to go into. You see how all these sugar alcohols end in OL: xylitol, erythritol, sorbitol, malitol, lactitol. You don't see that one as much. You really see like these guys, and which pets cannot have xylitol at all. Mannitol, you'll see. Neotame. Neotame's different. It's not a, sorry, sugar alcohol. I'm just going on a rant. But the OL, here connotes that it's a sugar alcohol when you see it on the label. And they are an artificial sweetener that can, when it passes into the intestines, it's in a very larger form compared to other foods. It can contribute to gut dysbiosis, but also it causes, because it's a harder nutrient to pass, because it's not really broken down, it just passes through you. It can pull more water into your intestines, causing that big, bloated feeling. And of course can cause different digestive distress, right? Diarrhea. Soy lecithin is on this list. I'm usually happier if I see sunflower lecithins used versus soy lecithins. Um, that's a better alternative. But yeah, this can just give you a little bit more of a background of what these nutrients, not nutrients, sorry, what these additives are found in, right? So we could just make more informed decisions. If you really want to read more too, what's great is with the dietary guidelines, if you go into, PubMed or Google Scholar, you could typically paste in these studies if you want to go through and read them and better understand. Depends on the level to which you want to go, but I always believe in opening the door and showing people what to look at to be informed, and of course, I always want to put it in that digestible form too, because I know everyone is busy and it's hard to get the time to do that, but it's cool to see your sources there. But yeah, these are some quick ingredients to try to avoid or limit on the food label. And of course, you'll get these slides. Another way to really help to monitor the ingredients, because I know sometimes it's like learning a foreign language. I can completely understand that. You can use apps like Yuka. Before Yuka came out, my friend and I would use Fujicate when we were in college, and we'd be in the grocery store, her and we would grab the Fujicate app, which is also a food journal. It's not the greatest food journal, but it's a great way to like scan the food, and then it gives a letter grade. But we don't want apps to think for us. Take we want to know what the app knows to learn for ourselves, right? So it would give a letter grade saying, okay, this food has a B minus or a C plus or an A, so her and I would bet like nothing, but we would be like, I bet it's an A, I bet it's a B, whatever. And then you click it and see why, right? Oh, this has red dye 40, made with different gasoline products, for example. Um, or this has some sodium benzoate linked to kidney cancer. Okay, well, even if it's not a very strong link, maybe if, I could try to reduce my intake of it and eat more whole and processed foods, I can reduce my chance, even, if there is that strong link. And we know saccharin, for example, that can cross the placental barrier for those who are pregnant. So it's good to just keep informed, and knowledge is power. But okay, so that was our nutrition segment. I didn't want to miss over the physical activity guidelines, as they are also a part of this. So the USDA physical activity guidelines has two subsets: the cardiovascular health aspect and the strength training aspect, right? The strength training is not new, that's been a part of the guidelines. So it just tends to not be spoken about that much. I don't know why. So, cardiovascular health. So, adults should get at least 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity per week. So, moderate intensity is like we're talking, maybe futzing around on the phone, whatever. But vigorous activity is different, right? So it says 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity activity, and not and sorry, I'm trying to like not let my brain go faster than my mouth, but the vigorous activity is an or, right? So 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity activity, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous activity, right? It is a little bit of a mix around, right? Some days we go for a walk, some days we go for a higher intensity run, etc. But that vigorous activity, what is the notable difference between moderate is, okay, it's a pace that it's difficult to talk, right? So when I'm working with clients that I'll personal train, I'll, start to strike up a conversation with them when they're training. And if, for them to say their sentence, my cat's going a little crazy right now. He's got zoomies. Sorry. But for them to strike up a conversation and try to string together, a set of about 7 words, like a sentence, right? They have to do a big inhale, like a right. What we were taught in personal training classes, like to ask someone to say, the Pledge of Allegiance, and if in the first sentence they have to go, that's how you can kind of tell. But you figure it out in conversation pretty easily, right? You start to perspire a little bit more when you're in introducing more vigorous intensity activity as well, because your heart rate's going up. The activity should be spread throughout the week. We don't want to do 300 minutes at once. I don't think anyone's thinking about that though. That would be a little nuts depending on what we're training for. Even bouts of about 10 minutes can count towards your total activity. So say you're trying to get 30 minutes activity in, and it's just a really slammed week at home and at work. If you do 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes in the afternoon on the lunch break, and 10 minutes in the evening, that is still similar to 30 minutes of activity for your day. Of course, if you're starting to exceed 300 minutes, there can be greater health benefits. But again, it's very individualized, right? Are you recovering? Are you sleeping? Are you fueling enough? But of course, that's spread throughout the week. So vigorous activity could be like running, salsa dancing, fast cycling, right? Moderate is like brisk walking, more casual cycling, leisurely swimming. And then, of course, the benefits of cardiovascular activity is lung health, right? Heart health, blood sugar health, because you are burning sugar in that process. You're burning carbs, especially if your heart rate's higher. If heart rate's lower, you're burning fat more. And of course, it helps to maintain a healthy weight. But what also does that is strength training, right? It's yin and yang. They both go together, not one or the other. So part of the dietary guidelines is to perform muscular strength training activities at least 2 days per week based on your guidance from your medical provider, right? You want to try to target legs, hips, back, abdomen, chest, shoulders, arms, right? Your major muscle groups. You can use a variety of resistance methods, body weight, right? We've got push-ups, we've got squats, we've got mountain climbers, we've got planks, just to name a very small few. We've got free weights or machines. We've got resistance bands, and there's always more and more things coming out, right? We've got our Pilates reformers, etc. Guidelines to improve the effectiveness. These guidelines to improve effectiveness can vary, right? So perform 8 to 12 repetitions per set, especially when you're newer starting out, going for like a 1 rep max if you're not with a personal trainer and depending on your musculoskeletal needs is not always a necessity, right? Of course, you do see lower rep training, but if you're uncertain, start with 8 to 12 reps of something you can maintain and start to feel a little bit of that slight muscular tension, right? Complete 1 to 3 sets per exercise. Endurance is going to be higher sets, but again, it depends on your goals. Strength training can be very individualized. This is a great place just to start. Increase resistance gradually over time, right? Take note of anything that feels tight or a little twang or something that is uncomfortable, right? Work with an OT, a PT, a sports chiropractor, a knowledgeable personal trainer to help adapt a program that fits your unique musculoskeletal needs. And of course, muscular training or strength training, your muscle is your metabolic motor. So strength training burns more calories throughout the day. Cardiovascular training burns more calories for that particular time you are doing the exercise, right? So that muscle, when you work it, can become a little bit more metabolically sensitive after you strength train, so it's requiring more fuel to keep going. The more muscle that you have, the higher your basal metabolic rate, right? That's how much calories you need to sustain yourself. So when someone has more muscle, they're burning more calories just to stay alive. They're burning more sugar. Building up your muscle mass helps to improve our bone density, right? Reduce risk for osteoporosis, osteopenia, why does that matter? Think about how many Americans break or fracture hips each day across the country, and about 50% will go on to live later years after 1 year of a hip break. So it is extremely important to focus on our bone health. Enhances our metabolism and our functional strength. So part of why I like strength training is I always see the individuals that I look up to, and it's not just athletes, these people on Instagram, I could care less. But the people I look at are my neighbor, like my neighbor, for example, who lives across the street. He's 90 years old, and we have to tell him, please don't clean your gutters. Like he is running around. He wants to use the snowblower and shovel, and he's healthy and he's fit, and I want to be that, right? That's amazing. That's freedom, right? Don't we all want freedom to be able to carry in our own groceries, to continue doing things that we love, seeing family, traveling? Hell, I want to be able to hike in the national parks at 90, right? Want to be a 90-year-old park ranger when I retire. So, like, think about your future self when it comes to adherence to the dietary guidelines, adherence to our cardiovascular guidelines, and adherence to the strength training. It's not about vanity, right? That's the fun side effect. But really it comes down to freedom and being free of disease, and being able to live our life the way that we intended to, right? And of course, in an enjoyable manner. So I think that's really important, and it's about more time with family, right? So it's about having our why, right? Because sometimes when you're putting these activity guidelines into practice and you're looking at it like, okay, I want to try to do these about 150 minutes of cardio at least a week, and 2 times a week of strength training. We might need that little push, right, to get going. We might need that little push to increase those vegetables, etc., right? Get that motivation to keep going, and think about your why, right? So starting small, begin with 10 to 15 minutes of activity per day, right? If it depends on where we're starting from, right? Build gradually over time. So you could build up in terms of time or intensity, right? I'm going to walk 10 minutes a day. I'm just using this as an example, 3 miles per hour. Okay, it's getting easier for me now. Now I'm going to do 10 minutes a day at 3.5 miles per hour, or maybe I'm going to do 15 minutes per day at 3 miles per hour. So that's the difference between intensity being the speed or time, right? Quite literally time. So scheduling the workouts in, treating it like an appointment, setting boundaries, I think can be a major barrier for some, right? Setting that boundary, maybe working with our jobs, right, to increase, you know, what we are able to do within the allotted time we have for work, saying no when it comes to staying late, if that's possible, right? I think that's always a touchy subject with work. Of course, family, right? If a lot of individuals say, but I have to, take my kids to the baseball game or the lacrosse game. All right, can we walk the field while they practice, for example? I have a few patients, they're so adorable. They started walking during their son's baseball practices, around the field complex, so they could watch their sons grow and learn how to play, but also take a little time back for themselves too. Strength training, I have some families that are really adorable. They take like the dice, and they have the fitness dice and they roll it, and sometimes the kids try to partake in what's realistic for them, and you're mirroring behavior for the family, um, which is cool. So setting boundaries, I think, treating exercise like an appointment, and it'll get, once you start to carve the time, it becomes a little bit more of a habit, right? Mix it up. You can try to combine cardio and strength throughout the week, or another simple weekly plan is Monday 30-minute walk, Tuesday strength training, Wednesday could be a rest day or active recovery like yoga, Thursday maybe bike riding or another walk, uh, Friday strength training, so you're doing 2 total body training sessions, and of course Saturday Sunday could be rest time, or ideally active leisure, hiking, sports, walking. Something important that I didn't put a bullet point to that I really should, as a part of the dietary guidelines, is to really try to not take off of exercise more than 1 day of training in a row, more than 1 day in a row. I think that was introduced, I want to say, in the 2020 2020 guidelines. It's not super new, but so you don't want to have more than like you don't want to have 2 or 3 days off in a row unless say you just did a triathlon or something and you need to, really rest or you're recovering from an injury, for example. And we're talking about like walking, mobility exercises, yoga, for example. Tips for success is to choose activities that make you happy, right? Warmer weather is coming about. Is it beach volleyball at Cedar Beach? Is it going kayaking or paddleboarding? Is it getting out in the woods at all the beautiful parks near us? Staying consistent, not perfect, right? Just because, oh, I was supposed to go on Monday and I missed it on Monday. So now my whole week is forgone. Something is always better than nothing. I had a friend who pulled his hamstring and he always runs. And I was like, okay, well, you can't run. Why don't you go for a walk? He said, because I don't walk. That's, not what I do. Da, 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 da. And then he eventually went for a walk and he was like, oh, you know what? It was better than, doing nothing. So something is always better than nothing. You can use a tracker or an app if it helps to give you motivation to see your steps. Caloric burn in terms of a measure of work versus what you burn in terms of your calories, and now I can eat this many calories. That's not always accurate to use, but caloric burn is a good measure of work for sure, especially if you're using the same fitness watch or ring, etc., per day to say, okay, maybe I rode the bike one day, but then I ran another day and then I strength trained another day. Am I consistently burning about the same amount each week, etc. Just used to kind of track and look back at your exercise and noticing trends throughout the year. Listen to your body and rest when needed. Go with a friend or family member. Sometimes that can promote motivation because it makes it enjoyable, but don't not go to the gym because your friend or family member can't come with you, right? Be the motivator that goes and they want to come with you. Of course, you can add music or say you're walking on the treadmill, add a good show that, you create a little carrot in the stick and you say, okay, I can't, but I'm not going to watch this show or listen to this podcast unless I'm doing X, Y, and Z exercise to create a little incentive. But at the end of the day, the goal is to make physical activity a regular part of your lifestyle. Of course, we're at Functional Nutrition RX in 41 John Street in Babylon. We're located inside Elevation Fitness. So we work together with our personal trainers and even Dr. Frank, our sports chiropractor, Dr. Frank Valenti, to create this interdisciplinary model of care to help patients and clients introduce these dietary guidelines to their day to day. Does anyone have any questions though? I know I went way over today, of course. Oh no. So I do want to say thank you to everybody for being a part of the presentation. I'm going to send out the slides tonight to everybody and the recording and some of the attached documents for those to see. I'm popping into the chat now to see if there's any questions. Oh, thank you, Carolyn. I appreciate you answering. Yes, of course, Jacqueline. We're going to send those slides out via email. Fish with olive oil fried. I have Crohn, low fiber. Patrick, what is your question in pertaining to? Are you asking if it's okay to utilize olive oil when frying? He might have signed off because I went long. So I'll put it in the recording. But olive oil, you want to utilize in temperatures under 275. If you're going above 275, avocado oil, extra virgin olive oil, no heating though, of course. And of course, if someone has to follow a low fiber diet, it's working with a registered dietitian to implement those unique needs. Jacqueline, awesome. Congratulations on the loss. Wedding at 8 months, I lose 20 pounds. So what do I do? So I would recommend working one-on-one with a registered dietitian so that someone can look at your unique dietary habits and lifestyle and start to create realistic goals that are going to be most impactful to you. I do recommend, I know I sound a little diet culture-y, but tracking your intake in like a chronometer, it more creates the ability. I'm not talking about just calorie tracking. I don't want to come off old fashioned, but more so it's this awareness, right? Like, oh, I'm noticing, oh, my protein is at 50 grams on these days. I'm just saying a random number. Or I'm noticing my fiber, I'm just tipping to 20 grams. I really want to try to reach 25 grams. So it can create like realistic metrics and help to really understand like what is going on, so that we can figure out what are the speed bumps and to overcome them. But you've already done wonderful, wonderful work. But it really depends on activity output and sleep, and what your current intake is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, wait, am I
Oh,
muted?
absolutely.
Okay, no, I'm
No,
not.
you're good.
Okay.
You're good.
Yeah, I actually meet with Amanda Soldano. So she's actually the person that I work with. So she's really good.
Oh, beautiful. I'm not aware. I don't think she's a part of our practice, but that's wonderful that you're working with somebody.
Yeah, I think well, I don't know if she's private now, but I thought she was, but I don't know. I think she was part of your. I don't know if she was part of your practice or she was in Georgia and then her family's in Long Island. She has two
Oh,
kids.
Allison.
Allison,
Allison.
Allison,
I forgot Allison's
Allison.
last name. She
Sorry.
is wonderful. No, that's wonderful. That makes me happy. I love Allison. She's a sweetheart. I forgot Allison's last name for a
She's
second. I always know her by like I always see Allison on her Zoom.
She's
That's
she's
awesome.
so good. Yeah, and honestly, I tried the sun fiber now. I'm adding berberine now into my diet too. So I think it was taking my body a little while to adjust to it. But I've just noticed that I've been at a plateau because I also got off. I was on birth control for a while since I was 18. I recently just got off
Wow.
of it and my body was like readjusting and all that, but I'm an active cyclist, so I'm always cycling and running and running and stationary bike. But I just
Very.
noticed my weight's been at like 220, and I do like a vegan juice cleanse once a month, but
Mhm.
I've noticed my weight has been like at a standstill now, and I just don't know what it
Mm.
is.
Well,
So
when you do the juice cleanse, is looking at sometimes there could be some sneaky sugars in there, and just double giving a double check there, right? Like, because sometimes
okay.
it could be like carbs at once, but you're getting a lot of phytonutrients and vitamins and minerals during that. But okay, maybe if they're might need some protein to or healthy fats to blunt the spikes from that. Or of course, when you're coming off birth control, you're reestablishing that connection between the brain and the ovaries, and sometimes that can also take a little bit of time, usually 3 to 6 months, for things to kind of get back to regularity. So there is that little bit of uh, a
Growth.
journey, right? Is involved for sure.
Yeah.
But
Oh
look,
well,
I would
thank you.
recommend definitely, of course, looking at hormones if needed to measure that.
Yeah, definitely. I was definitely going to talk to my primary care doctor about it too, because I was on a cholesterol medication to fix my cholesterol too. And now my
Mm,
cholesterol's at a total different 360 now since I'm on the medicine because I have that gene in my family, that I have to be on the statin, because my body makes cholesterol. But,
that's fair.
now
So fiber is
fiber, yeah, sun fiber now is my friend.
well, thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it, and definitely keep in touch too.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you. Really, it was very informative. So thank you.
Thank you guys. And I see in the chat too. So if anybody has any particular um, ideas that you're interested in learning more about, please don't hesitate to message me. Everyone's going to get an email from me with this recording. So of course, if you're like, I'm interested in learning more about X, Y, and Z, just let me know. All right, guys. Enjoy your night and be well. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Jacqueline.